I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Gent at the front said to talk louder, so I'll try and speak up. I can descend into mumbling sometimes, but I'll try not to. I'm afraid it's only me providing all the sound effects, so I'd like to thank the university for inviting me. As I say, thanks to Robert for the introduction. Thanks also to Robert Nola, who's done so much to prepare the way for me. And thanks especially to Michael Neal, who was a sort of instigator of this thing. And thanks for the Hood Fellowship for funding it, as it were. It's my first time in New Zealand. It's, as I say, a great honour to be here. It's a bit, for me, a bit like taking coals to Newcastle, bringing cartoons to New Zealand, because some of our best, in fact, indeed, our very best cartoonists came from New Zealand. My own predecessor on The Guardian, it's not quite true, I've been principal cartoonist since '81. I started off doing a strip in the back of the paper, which is a slightly less auspicious part of the paper, but the guy in the front doing the main cartoons was a guy called Les Gibbard, who hailed from the South Island, is sadly dead now, but he was a wonderful guy, and as I say, New Zealand has provided some very fine cartoonists to the world, not least Les, but also, of course, David Lowe, or latterly Sir David Lowe, as he became known. But he, I think, for me, the greatest cartoonist of the 20th century, greatest political cartoonist anyway. A word of explanation about the picture in front of you. It's actually an illustration I did for an exhibition I had a few years back, which was just to show all the prime ministers I'd dealt with. There is one exception, but I'll move on to her in a sec. I'll go through them from in order of time, as it were. At the back, you see Margaret Thatcher. This is in front of her successor, John Major. And then to John Major's left, or on the far right, with showing his bum, that's Tony Blair. He was succeeded. Over on the extreme left is me. I'm the self-portrait as an artiste. But I'm sitting next to Gordon Brown, who succeeded Blair after a very bitter kind of relationship they had. And then at the front, David Cameron, who some of you might remember. I apologise also. I'll get the apologies out of the way quick, because there's a lot of British politics in this, and I know this is New Zealand, and it's a bit of a cheat coming here talking about British politics, but I hope a lot of it is, there are strong similarities. They're mainly Tories, including Blair, who I think was a Tory. I'm not quite sure about Gordon Brown, but you couldn't put an ideological fag paper between either of them. Anyway, that's what that is. But there's one missing, of course, and that's our current Prime Minister, Theresa May, and this is her, and I have no explanation for why I draw her as a scary, evil clown, other than the fact that she's an evil, scary clown. And it just suddenly came one day, and this is the cartoon where it happened. She's a rare politician in that she's identified by her feet a lot, and if you look at her feet, she wears these, or she often wears them, not all the time, but quite a lot of the time she wears these leopard skin kitten heels. And this is a quite deliberate choice on her part. It's not me being sexist, it's the fact that she plays up to that footwear. She loves clothes, she loves her footwear, and I have a picture in my possession, sadly, I can't show it to you, but it's of her showing off her kitten-heeled shoes on a bollard, and there's a gang of photographers focusing in on the feet. So it's quite deliberate on her part, but that's partly what I'm going to talk about, is how we, or I, or anybody, how we work on politicians' images, and how politicians work on their own images at the same time, and how the two processes interconnect, and one is definitely, from my point of view, designed to undermine the other. Anyway, that's Theresa. But I started off doing comic strips, and I've always been a comic strip artist, so just to explain about my style, if you like, I'm very different from the Gerald Scarfs or Ralph Steadmans of this world. I draw very small, I started off doing children's comics. I always loved the Beano when I was a kid. And this is my first published work, which was about my failure as a teacher. Because I studied art for many years. I came out of that process thinking I must be socially useful. So I got a job in a school in Birmingham where we were living at the time. And it was the most desperate year of my life. And I summed it up in this strip. It was a 4-page strip called The Legend of Bigfoot, because for some reason the kids called me Bigfoot. I couldn't understand that, but it was hell. I didn't want to be there. I didn't believe in myself as a teacher. I didn't know what I was doing. I shouldn't have been left in charge of 30 kids. It's bad enough with... I've got 4 kids of my own, and it's bad enough with them. They're all grown up now, but so I had to get out. I just didn't fit in. I was like a monster out of nowhere, and so in the end, I gave up the struggle. Well, I had to wear the leather pads, and I had the briefcase, and I was trying to fill the role, but never quite working. And then I just left, and that was it. But I left to become a cartoonist. So I had to have a strong stimulus to become a cartoonist, because there's no career path to cartoonery. I never really thought of it seriously as a way of earning a living until I had to desperately get away from teaching. And I had a friend, a very good old friend called Kipper Williams, who was already doing it. He was already starting to earn money as a cartoonist. So I thought, in a maddened sense of jealousy, well, if he can do it, I'll have a try too. So I started off living in Birmingham at the time, and I thought, what I'll do is I'll do a study of imaginary pubs of the West Midlands. It didn't get very far. There was only about 2. This was one called The Fitted Stinch, and it's faded, sadly, with age. That happens to art sometimes when you draw with a felt tip pen. And there's a couple in the background saying, fancy a quick one down the Stinch. That's how they speak in Birmingham. But I love that drawing because it's so loose and so just easy, and I'm trying to explain the problem with being a cartoonist is ink and paper. Black ink on white surface is very unforgiving. So the whole art of it, if you like, is to try and impart kind of life and movement to it. This was when I was still a student, so this is Edward Heath. He's a bit before my time professionally, but I did that during the miners' strike of '74. So I wasn't doing it for a living then. This is another one a year or 2 later about Harold Wilson. They were the great politicians dominating the era. It's not a bad cartoon. It looks quite like him. As you can see, all the switches are turned to normal, except for the last one, credibility, which is turned to max. So that's it's an attempt at a political cartoon. But what I was really into was comics. So the first regular paid work I got was for IPC, International Publishing Corporation, who publish all around the world, based in London. And I went to see this bloke who had every single idea across his desk you can imagine. He dealt with all the greats, people like Leo Baxendale, the bloke who invented the Bash Street Kids and all that stuff. And I went to him again and again, and I kept taking him ideas, and he sort of looked at me and said, my stuff was very sort of undergroundy and sub-Robert Crumb and a bit sort of ironic. And he said, well, you've got to remember the average age of our readers is 8 years old. So anyway, I kept coming back, and he'd seen everything. He was just very blasé. But one day I took him this idea, which was about a kid with his head on back to front. And he said, I've never seen that before. I'll tell you what, go away and work it up. If I like it, I'll take you on for a stint. And a stint was 30 weeks doing a page a week. And this is it. This is the one I did. This is the thing I took away and worked up, and this is the first page. It was a terrible thing, a terrible load of old rubbish about Dick Dobie, the back-to-front man, which was based on the $6 Million Man, Steve Austin, who was in a terrible accident and then got rebuilt and became bionic. The word bionic. He was partly robot, partly human. Anyway, so Dick Dobie is a bloke who had the same thing happen to him, but they put him back the wrong way round. And unfortunately, poor old Dick Dobie spoke in upside down mirror language. Anyway, it was a bit stiff, and it's all very awkward, as you can probably see. But within a couple of years, I was starting to loosen up, starting to get a bit of freedom in the line. And with cartooning, line is all important, life in the line, and conveying motion. How do you convey movement. How do you convey a bicycle disintegrating? How do you convey a lawnmower chewing up a pair of trousers? Well, these are all things that stock in trade for a strip cartoonist, but you have to learn them and you have to work them out for yourself. You have to somehow put rhythm and movement into a stiff, unyielding medium. I'm not an animator and never have been, never could be, but I'm strictly 2D. And this was a more successful one because poor old Dick Doobie died the death after a short spell, and this is one called The Gremlins, where they destroyed machinery. But to my intense surprise, coming to New Zealand, it was the first time I'd ever met anybody who'd read my comics when I was doing this stuff. I'd never actually met anybody in England who'd read it, but I met 2 people since I've been here who read Jackpot and Whoopee, which was a great thing, because of course these things were available all around the world. But as luck would have it, I was keen to do strips. I was also mad keen on politics, and I kept going, kept approaching various magazines. I got a success with Time Out. I got taken on there to do a weekly strip, but I didn't get the daily strip on The Guardian until 1981, and I'd submitted all sorts of ideas, went to see them, and eventually they took me on trial. So I did a trial, and this is one of the trial cartoons I did. You might remember the reference. This is where the If strip came from. It's If, based on the poem, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those 2 impostors just the same. Kipling, and that was because I'd heard that Margaret Thatcher had a copy of Kipling by her bedside table, so that kept me going. So I did a strip where there was a new If every day, and this was if Ben had the eyebrows and Healy had the stare. Tony Benn was the old left winger, and Dennis Healy was the old right winger. This was back in the early 80s, and same as it is now. The Labour Party was in desperate straits, and there I've given Dennis Healy the eyeballs, and I've given Tony Blair the stare, so I swapped them round. And the gentlemen of the press are saying I could never trust a man with eyebrows like that. They're definitely messianic. But the strip didn't really find that was never published. But the strip itself got going, and it's quite hard to get a strip off the ground. But it happened 6 months after I've been doing it. The Falklands War came along, which was kind of insane, surreal. Post-imperial monstrosity, which I had to deal with. Now, the difference with the war in the Falklands as it became, and certainly the Vietnam War, which I was brought up on, the media coverage thereof, the Vietnam War was, you saw the most horrendous images of destruction coming every day in the news. It was commonplace. Well, they learnt their lesson by the time the Falklands came along, because everything was controlled by the Ministry of Defence. And the only sort of imagery that was getting through had been approved by the MOD. And so actually an imaginary strip cartoon, a sort of fantasy, was actually quite a good way of dealing with the nonsensical situation of a task force sailing south to deal with an invasion of a distant possession. Anyway, I started off a bit Dan Dare-like with these 2 characters. What are the orders, Commander? We sail at dawn. Who knows what we're getting ourselves into this time, Mr. Kipling? It's not every day the international situation demands a showing by our armoured punts. So they're sailing south, this task force, and they're under attack from hostile albatross. Commander, what happens if we fail to get through? Pum, 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 pum. If we fail, then Mrs. Thatcher may fall. Pum, pum, pum. We surrender! Good God, man. And that's how the story developed. The able seaman Reg Kipling was becoming increasingly disaffected with the growing nonsense of this idiotic war, and Commander Jack Middletar, the Dan Dare lookalike, was struggling to maintain standards. And what you were getting in the actual papers at the time, and you still find this to this day, any war that happens, you get war picture library artists who are covering the conflict. So it's all done from imagination. So the Sunday Times does it. That's a particular, in the UK anyway, a particular offender. And I loved war picture library when I was a kid. I grew up on the stuff, but as the stuff of news, it's a bit lacking. So here we are, dramatic. And the end of all wars, of course, as we know. But it was a strange time because nobody knew what was happening. Everything was mediated by the MOD. Very little was happening for the first few weeks because actually nothing was happening. But then the action started. I did this cartoon, and it was a perfectly bland cartoon. Nothing had been happening when I drew the cartoon. Boom, wham, thud, Pym, it says. Pym was the name of the Foreign Secretary, so it's a really tedious play on words. But it never appeared. So that was the first time, well, probably ever really, I've had a paper strip not appear, and they've just not explained why. The reason it never appeared was because I think, I'm not sure of this, I still don't know the exact details, but I think maybe a picture of a ship blowing up had appeared and they considered it to be in poor taste, which is something you're always going to have a problem with. The strip was never very topical. It was weekly topical, which meant I did a whole week's worth at once and then sent it on the train up to the paper in London, who then sent it up to Manchester to be processed, and so on. So it was quite a long turnaround. So the nearest I came to topical was like 4 or 5 days ahead. So it didn't appear. So I was trying to work out what to do, and in the end the strip went completely into the dark, and this is 2 journalist characters of mine. They're 2 of my oldest characters, Harry Hardnose and Barry Blockhead. Is there anybody there? Oh, on your own, bunker. Who's that? My name's Harry Hardnose and this is my bunker. That voice, why does that voice seem so familiar? It's Barry Blockhead. What brings you to the arse end of the empire, my son? It's just, I can't remember. Put that bloody light out. There's a black slide for you. Good of you to grant us this interview, Major. Big show, hard chaps, major targets, softened up, shot down, taken out, hard-fighting, stiff resistance. Big push, pincer movement, hammer and anvil, tricky terrain, light casualties, frightened conscripts, holes in boots, threw down arms. Return to normal. Our lads, welcome copper, royal wedding mugs, Argentinians, lick wounds. Now, all that crap was actually verbatim what was coming out of the news. I haven't made any of it up. All those phrases were used. Not quite in the same clipped way, but anyway. I couldn't understand a great deal what that major said, Harry. Don't worry, son, that's basic MOD speak. You'll pick it up as you go along. It'll all make sense in good time. It's no use. I still can't think around that surprisingly light casualty I saw. Barry, I don't quite know how to put this. What you saw was any conflict, regrettable necessity, sustained fatalities, our hearts go out, never forget reasons why all this takes place, reasons fundamental to our civilization. Yeah, well, what are the reasons? Hang on, I'll ask the Major. And back to darkness again. Now, I was labouring away in the back of the paper doing the strip, but the person on the front catching the flak was, of course, Les Gibbard. And the one he caught particular flak for was this image, which is based, of course, on a famous wartime cartoon by Philip Zeck, which appeared in the Mirror. Now, this is in The Guardian, and as you see, Les has acknowledged that at the top. The caption was, which for some reason has got sliced off in my version of it, but the caption was, the price of sovereignty has increased, official. Now, this is the cartoon it was based on, which appeared in the Mirror during the war, which is the price of petrol has been increased by 1 penny, official. And that cartoon, Churchill himself actually tried to suppress. He was actually talked out of it in the end, but it was a great cartoon. It's a brilliant cartoon, and it catches a sort of moment and the desperation of war. He thought it would damage morale, but of course it's being open about the horrible things that everybody knows that happens in war. And Zeck was a great cartoonist. So Les was simply reflecting what Zeck had done and using it in a new context. And Les caught the most amazing crap. He was called a terrorist, I don't know. He was called treachery, traitor, by the Sun, no less. That scum rag, Murdoch rag. Anyway, he was catching the flak, and I was lurking in the back, getting away with more, probably. Anyway. But we all hark back to the greats. We all have to, and there's probably the greatest of all was James Gillray in the late 18th century. And this is the ultimate image of geopolitics. It couldn't be bettered. It hasn't been bettered. You couldn't say anything better about geopolitics than this image, the plum pudding in danger, where you have Napoleon in the blue and William Pitt, the Prime Minister, the Tory Prime Minister, on the left in the red, and Napoleon is carving off Europe and Pitt is carving off the ocean, which is a precise description of exactly what was happening in the world at the time. Now, not only was he a brilliant, with the first really proper political cartoonist, because he was obsessed with politics, but he did a much more important thing, is he turned the cast of politics, if you like, into comic characters, who everybody recognised. So he dealt with royalty. This is a cartoon that's appearing to be, it's riding two horses at once, it's backing two horses at once. On the one hand, it's criticising the Whigs for being anti-royal. That is at the time of the French Revolution. The previous one was 1795. This is from, I think it might be from 1794 or 3. But anyway, the man about to have his head lopped off is, of course, the King, George III. The fat bloke in the yellow waistcoat is Charles James Fox, the Whig leader at the time. I think one of the ones on the right is Richard Brinsley Sheridan, also a prominent Whig. But you can see the fun that Gillray himself is having with ripping the piss out of the whole situation. You can see Queen Charlotte dangling off a lamppost and Pitt dangling off a lamppost behind them. So Pitt is, Gillray is very consciously enjoying what he's doing. This is Gillray's take on the entire House of Hanover, minus the first two Georges. This is in one room. At the front, you have George III holding a candle. It's the wedding night of his daughter, who is marrying an exceedingly fat bloke. As you can see, the guy with his back to us, whose paunch leads ahead of him. And behind them are her two brothers, or three brothers, I think, he was incredibly fertile, was George III. Anyway, the ones you recognise, one in blue is George IV, who would become. He became the Prince Regent when his dad went mad. Behind him is the Duke of Clarence in the red. The Duke of Clarence, the younger brother. And this is another wonderful contemporary of Gillray's, Richard Newton, a very modern cartoon. You'd think, well, I couldn't get away with that in The Guardian, I know for a fact. You try shitting in the face of the monarch, you couldn't get away with it. But this is what they were doing in a time when there was no freedom of the press, so it's astonishing what they did get away with. I suppose the only reason I can think of is because you have competing power centres, one of whom likes the abuse of the other, and the other likes the abuse of the other. So that's the way, between the cracks between those power, the Prince's party and the King's party, who both loathed each other, and the Prince's party favoured the Whigs, the King's party was the Tories. Between those monsters, as it were, some freedom could be created. This is a wonderful image. It's to do, actually, with sort of nauseating press coverage at the time of a royal wedding between Frederica, Princess of Prussia, and Frederick, Duke of York. The two Freds were marrying. And the coverage was drooling, sycophantic drool, as ever, nothing changes. And so Gillray drew this as a kind of lampoon of the idiot sycophantic nature of the commentary about what was going on. And it's called Fashionable Contrast, the Duchess's little shoe yielding to the magnitude of the Duke's foot. And it's just a fabulous image. You don't need to explain it. It's self-explanatory. So I plundered this recently myself. As I say, it's very unfortunate to have a Prime Minister who isn't identifiable by her feet, but also a President who, I've flipped things around a bit, but the ghastly little orange feet of Trump. But Gillray was just, for me, this is my favourite one of Gillray's of all time, because this says everything about monarchy that needs to be said. It's monarchy. Where does the monarchy come from? Here's the coloured version. It's monarchy, an excrescence, a fungus, a toadstool upon a dunghill. And look at it, the crown embedded in filth. And if you like, the excrescence is the face of William Pitt, the Tory Prime Minister, which was the King's party, of course. It's such a beautiful, such a modern, such a stark, wonderful image, and for me it's why it marks Gilray's greatness. This is George III as he would like to be remembered. This is George III as Gilray presented him to us, a temperance enjoying a frugal meal of boiled eggs with his wife, Queen Charlotte. This is George IV as he would like us to remember him. This is George IV, a voluptuary under the horrors of digestion as depicted by Gilray. And what else can you say about it? But Gilray was so influential to so many people, and he's not only influenced us who follow in his footsteps, but he's also influenced Jacques-Louis David in France, was a massive admirer of Gilray. He's a painter who painted Napoleon and all the rest of it in a very unsatirical way. But his stuff just leaps out. But his stuff also influenced his contemporaries, and this is one by George Cruikshank, who was a younger contemporary. And this is, of course, George IV. This is from a satire written by a bloke called William Hone, called The Political House That Jack Built. And there's a difference between Gilray and this, because Gilray is a kind of fine art object, basically. They are etchings, they're hand-coloured, they're quality objects, they're expensive. They're not for everybody. People can see them in the print shop windows, but you can't get a copy yourself. But this stuff was Cruikshank. This is where they're starting to use the technique of engraving on the end of boxwood and then stamping out numerous editions of not just tens or hundreds, but thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. And and of course you can see the kind of imagery that Gilray was doing is being repeated by Cruikshank and developed and expanded around. And that's where the problem about freedom of the press comes in, because of course now you've got mass production. So there were numerous attempts to suppress Hone's work, and he was prosecuted for blasphemous libel 3 times on the trot, and he won 3 times on the trot, being prosecuted by the actual by the Lord Chancellor of the land, the highest law officer in the land. And that's, in a sense, one of the establishing points of freedom of the press, because, Hone was a great man for having achieved that, but his satires are always vividly illustrated by Cruikshank. Queen Victoria came along, and by the time Queen Victoria came along, of course, the old vicious style was going out of fashion, as it had been prevalent for decades, and these things do move in waves, and things became more polite. What with the explosion in print anyway, the explosion in illustrated material. So she came off very lightly and was never actually properly satirized by anybody in the public prints. If you look at Punch, it's actually slavishly devoted to her. The only way you're going to find satire of Queen Victoria is in the damn dastardly continental papers like L'Assiette au Beurre in France. And this is the year of her death in 1901. You can see her going to hell. At the time of the Boer War, which was severely criticised at the time of the Boer War, which gave us concentration camps, amongst other things. This is her son, Edward VII, as depicted by the same man, Jean Weber, in the same publication, L'Assiette au Beurre, which means the plate of butter. I think it's a French slang for a bun or a bribe. L'Impudique Albion, this is called. This is how it was published in Britain. But how do how does one deal with causing offence, causing problems, different cultural norms? Well, recently there was a terrible thing happened, which was in the beginning of 2015, there was the Charlie Hebdo killings, when 12 people were massacred by 3 people, I think it was 3 people with automatic weapons who just walked into the editorial offices and slew 12 people, amongst whom 5 were cartoonists. And, so I had to do this one on the day. I was totally shocked. I was even more shocked because I knew one of the guys who was killed, a lovely guy called Tinius, who was a fabulous cartoonist, French cartoonist. French cartooning and English cartooning are very different traditions, different levels of rudeness about different things. The French are far more easy about sex, about bodies, about body parts. They've got there's almost like a French house style. It's very loose rhythmic kind of pen style, but very rude, very mad. And Tinius was a prime example, and his work was absolutely fabulous. So to hear he'd been killed like that was just a shock as well. At the same time, I was getting everybody, all the radio companies and TV companies were ringing up saying, "You're a cartoonist, what do you think?" Which is a bit difficult, and also you've got to do one at the same time. So this is what I came up with, and it's like just a sense of desperation, trying to sort of maintain a kind of defiance against these idiots, these fools, these jokers well, they're not dressed up in skeleton suits themselves, but I'm imagining they did with their Mickey Mouse ears. But it goes back. I mean, the first time I had pause for thought was at the time of, course, the Rushdie affair back in the late 80s, and this was one I did in the New Statesman at the end of in 89. This is the Ayatollah snuff me a scapegoat. He was offering a 3 million quid reward for snuffing out Salman Rushdie. Well, that's, of course, gave us all pause for thought, but it never really applied to cartoonists until this is my rejection of all religions around about 2001. If there's any religion I've failed to offend, please dial the number below. But then the Danish thing broke in February 2006. Actually, it had been bubbling on since the previous September, but it only these cartoons had been commissioned by this right-wing publication called Jyllands Posten in Jutland in Denmark, and I've always felt in a bit two minds about it, because the Danish cartoons were commissioned by a paper, a right-wing paper, which was just basically a wind-up. They were do it to deliberately wind up the Islamic community, and they certainly succeeded. But it was the cartoonists who caught the rat. The cartoonists were commissioned, they did the jobs, but it wasn't them in charge of the process. There's only one of the cartoons that anybody remembers, which is of the bloke with the turban and the fuse fizzing away, which is a bit of a cliche, not particularly good cartoon, but it did cause an awful lot of bother. And he's still under police protection to this day. But one of the cartoons actually had a sort of blackboard and a teacher in front of the blackboard. The blackboard had some Arabic writing on it. Now, of course, the worthies at Jyllands Posten hadn't bothered to translate it. What the writing actually said was, Jyllands Posten is a load of right-wing bollocks, or words to that effect. Yet this guy got the same death threats as everybody else. But so there are all kinds of levels of irony at work. But my attempt, when this news broke about cartoon riots and cartoon deaths even, was this, and it was just a sort of turning to animals, if you like. But after some days' consideration, I was able to sort of put a more... I often quote from frames of TV things. And this was before Bin Laden was ever killed, but anyway, what I love about cartooning is you can be ambiguous, though what people assume cartooning always means one thing or means that. It can do, but it can also mean several things at once, and it's also quite layered, which is something I enjoy immensely. But on the day of the Charlie Hebdo massacre, I had to do not only a big one, but I had to do a strip as well, and I was sort of puzzling how to do this and how to take it further. These cartoonists that were killed, it's often sort of a kind of lazy thought that, oh, they just went a bit too far, they took it away a bit too far over the top. No, these were not just any old rabble of cartoons. These were the top of the tree. These were there was a great cartoonist. There were cartoonists who'd drawn children, who were known for the work they'd done for children for years. Two of them were in their 70s. And they'd done this, it was for the Mohammed edition that they were being done. The Mohammed edition of Charlie Hebdo is actually very funny. It's very well done, very deliberately targeted against a religion that wants to destroy people for criticising it or laughing at it. So it's really taking it on direction, which the Danish cartoons never did. The Danish cartoons were a sort of subject of a journalistic process in control of the paper itself. But the Charlie Hebdo, the cartoonists themselves were doing it, and they were taking a risk. And they did take a risk, and they suffered the ultimate penalty. And I often think we don't respect enough what they did. I think what they did was actually heroic. Even if it was foolhardy, it was heroic. So this is my attempt. People were saying, "Why you draw? Yeah, draw Mohammed. Draw that. Go on, draw Mohammed. Yeah, yeah." I said, "Fucking hell, Because of course, this is what I did. Monsieur l'Artiste, what's up, Monsieur l'Artiste? Is a character that crops up. He speaks with an outrageous French accent, and I am pissed off. Oh, this je suis Charlie business. Je suis Charlie mon cul. Fucking cartoonists, wankers, all of them. What about les artistes? So this is my final frame. Moi, je suis Mohammed. So I sent that in, and of course it got bounced back. So no, we can't put that one in, Steve. It's if that gets taken out of context, we could have our offices in the Middle East burnt down. And I perfectly understand. I'm not going to sort of say, go to the wall just for a frame of a cartoon. So I sort of tried to tone it down slightly, take out the green, which is green is a significant colour in Islam. No, it wasn't good enough. Anyway, so eventually, I was getting these emails. We were all cartoonists were getting these emails. Why didn't you draw? Why didn't you draw Miami? Come on, you're scared, And I had one that said, you big fat cunt. So I did this. This is, moi je suis un gros con barbu. And, you big fat bearded cunt. Anyway, that got through. Didn't cause any bother at all. So, it's funny old world. What does cause bother, and this is the strip, again, I'm talking about, not the big ones. It's funny some toes you tread on, and in particular toes, which is even worse in a sense, Islam or Israel-Palestine, is the SNP, the Scottish National Party. And this is Nicola Sturgeon. This is post-referendum, where the referendum had been lost, but it's pre the election when actually the SNP wiped the board. They swept the board and wiped out the Labour Party in Scotland pretty well. I will happily support a Labour government on a case-by-case basis, and I will not make Trident a red line issue. Now that's what, because the SNP very properly are against Trident. It's something I've always believed is a nonsense as well. It's a political issue and they played it. But she said, stuck in my mind, we will not make it a red line issue. So this is, well, what is their red line issue? I asked myself. I will never ever compromise on our core demand for incest and Scottish country dancing. Now, that went down like a cup of cold sick in certain quarters. There's cascades of emails and complaints below the line coming out. And how dare you accuse the Scottish people of incest? And anyway, I've been doing it for some time. This is Alex Salmond, who was her predecessor, about the wording of the referendum. It was pre-referendum. And Alex Salmond was great because he's the only politician I know who looks like a space hopper. But there was an unholy alliance, I think, between the Tories and the SNP on this one anyway. A match made in heaven. Your face, my arse. Now you recognise the man on the left, I hope. You might recognise this geezer. He was the Duke of Clarence, who I mentioned earlier. This is a Gillray picture of the Duke of Clarence, La Promenade en Famille. The Duke of Clarence had an unofficial family. He was married, illegally it turned out, to an actress called Dorothy Jordan, and they were a very productive, very fruitful relationship. They had several children, and this is them promenading en famille to Bushey in northwest suburbs of London. This is Duke of Clarence became William IV, who followed his brother George IV. This is how he would, of course, like to be remembered. And this is his direct descendant, David Cameron. And if you've wondered why David Cameron is so posh, it's because he's more royal than the Queen. He is direct in line from William IV. I think he's fifth cousin of the Queen now. But this is him, terribly posh. He came on the scene in 2005, a very plausible young man, completely enthralled to Tony Blair and his method. Tony Blair was dominating politics then. The Tory party were in nowhere, but so he admired everything Tony Blair was about, which was he could do it too, except he didn't have the mad eyeball, he didn't have the ears, and he didn't have the teeth. Young, gifted, and plump. But this is he burst on the scene with his first conference as leader, which was very unusual for a Tory conference because it was very, very green and very, very blue and if you look at that backdrop, this is a new direction. There are rays and there are leaves and trees, and all those things were moving. So it's quite new technology. There was an animated backdrop with leaves and trees and rippling light, and it was like being at the bottom of a pond with thousands of Tories. It really was quite disturbing. So the usual old Tories were just sort of looking a bit stunned at what was going on, because they had the oddest people on stage you would never think of. There were sort of green people like George Monbiot, and there was Jeanette Winterson up on stage. What's going on? They weren't Tories, but they were sort of, Tories were talking to people who weren't Tories. So they were opening up Torydom. But he's so upper class. He's so upper class, he likes to go shooting on his father-in-law's 20,000-acre estate on the island of Jura in the Hebrides. And he can shoot 2 stags with 2 shots. Those who really know me call me 2 stags. Read my lips. I am the future. 1 man, 2 stags. What do we want? Man boobs. When do we want them? Soon. Now, something about David Cameron, which I've been struggling for a while, is kind of androgyny about him. He is very, very smooth. Make way for the future, he's saying to grizzly old Gordon Brown. Then he started pronouncing about transparency, because of course the MP's expenses was the big story then. The MP's it's a very small deal in corruption, but anyway, it was a big story. And so he kept on going about being transparent. And I tried to think of the only transparent organism I could think of, which is Dave the jellyfish. I can sit on a bike, and I'm completely transparent. Well, there's something about it that sort of worked, but I wasn't quite sure what it was, but all I did know was that drawing jellyfish is a serious pain in the arse. So here's Mr. Clean from Gordon Brown versus Mr. Transparent. It's a real fiddle using blue ink and a kind of translucency. So in the end, I couldn't carry on with that, but as luck would have it, suddenly these billboards appeared around the country with this thrusting head at one side, the head of David Cameron, saying, "I'll cut the deficit, not the NHS." And he looked so smooth, so impossibly smooth. People were saying, "Oh, it's been airbrushed." Well, of course, I knew he hadn't been airbrushed because I'd observed him very close up. So I was just so outraged at this image. I just unrolled a huge condom over his head, and it just gave me a kind of satisfaction. I don't know why. And it worked for me. It worked a treat, but unfortunately the editor didn't like it. But anyway, these things happen. Well, actually, it's the only time it happened in this case. But he does. He does look like a condom. There's no getting away from it. These are sketches from life. This is Dave photographed from life. You look at him. There are no visible hair follicles. He is very pink. And this is Dave as the famous picture of Dave in the Bullingdon Club, and it also features Boris as well. He was in it, and George Osborne was in it as well. The Bullingdon Club was a drinking club for very, very upper-class people at Oxford, which was devoted basically to smashing up restaurants and smashing up themselves. Anyway, so he developed into this after a great deal of trouble with the editor, who said, "I don't want to see any more condoms in the paper," via a third party. He sent a message and said, "Too many condoms here, Steve." So we had to come to a hideous compromise. You notice this one was during my tussle with the editor, so it's not a condom, it's a balloon. There's a terrible but critical conceptual difference between condom and balloon. And eventually I had a sort of a forlorn email late one night, because I had real bad arguments with him. I was saying, look, condoms aren't rude, they're just pieces of rubber. Kids talk about them. There's, post-AIDS, everybody knows what a condom is. And he was saying, no, it's too many condoms, it's too rude, too disgusting. He didn't actually specify. He said, no, I have spoken. It was like, I've banned condoms, that's it, I'm the editor. Yeah. And it was like, I was banging my head on the desk almost, and I was really cross, and we had some bad fallings out. But anyway, it rolled on for a month or two, and then I had an email late one night on the phone, and he's got a BlackBerry, and he was obviously pissed, And he said, Steve, I'm at a dinner. I'm being trashed for the condom ban. The condom ban is hereby revoked. Alan. Anyway, so I was able to do full-blooded condoms from then on, pink and teats and everything. But what Dave, of course, is famous for is austerity. That's what he did. That's what he drove through with the aid of the Liberals, who were even more keen on austerity than he was. And then finally, of course, for the affair of the pig's head, which perhaps we'd better not go into in too much detail. But an interesting thing about Dave, this is a sort of, I suppose, a thing about politician style. You have podiums or lecterns, and Dave had a wooden lectern, and he still has it, I think, which is always brought out, wheeled out, screwed to the floor, and then Dave comes out and does his piece. And Dave is very sensual. He sort of braces his legs like that. He's very... I've watched him do this. It's really quite disturbing. So that's sort of where that came from. But how do politicians develop their image? How do we do it? How do they do it? How do we follow them? How do we not follow them? There's me trying to draw her as one of the undead. This is Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher as she was. This is a later version looking back on the day Thatch broke out. Where there is disco, may we bring new romantic shit. Where there is error, may we bring smacked bottom. Where there is doubt, may we bring foghorns. Where there is despair, may we bring destitution. I remember that day, May the 4th, 1979, still etched on my brain. It's still one of those bad days in your life. Anyway, this is very early on. I hadn't really got her at all, as you can see from this one. The caricature is basically a rendering of a photograph. But then she hadn't got herself either. She was wearing these strange blazers with sort of piping around the cuffs and around the collar. She hadn't developed herself as a character, but here she was at her first conference as Prime Minister, and so good to know that once people are behind one, Transylvanian undead against the health service, denationalise the blood banks now, Toy Town Young Conservatives, give ICI charitable status. I didn't have my brain shot out in 2 world wars, you bloody fairies could take over. But within a year, she'd sort of developed her image. She'd lowered her voice, slowed down, darkened her hair. The quiff had become more solid. And there's something about the eyeballs that was resolving as well. This was never published, I hasten to add, and I don't think she ever said that. But it sort of captures her essence very well, and it was sort of within a year of the previous cartoon. And this is how it turned out. That's what I turned it into in Maggie's Farm, which I was then doing in Time Out. And I actually, the previous one, I'd never actually went to that Tory conference, which is in Blackpool. I did go to this one, which is in Brighton, and it was like a gathering of the undead. This is where she came up with the memorable phrase, "The lady's not for turning." So I was sitting there looking up her nose while she said this, and it really was quite terrifying. But it started a process where I've become hooked on going to party conferences. I don't know why, but I love it. I can't get enough of it. This is her in '83, banishing the dark, divisive clouds of Marxist socialism from the land. She won by a landslide then, 144 was the majority. And then '87, she stood for election again, and she expressed the desire to go on and on and on and on and on and on. Things were starting, rivets were starting to fall out, screws were starting to go loose. But she still got elected by a massive majority, even though she was promising to bring in the poll tax. This is the absurdity of politics, that people hadn't really thought what the poll tax was, what an absurd nonsense it was. But within a couple of years, people are actually, especially the poor old Scots who got delivered the poll tax a whole year earlier than anybody else in the kingdom, and of course everybody was up in arms. Even in Maidenhead they were having riots. This is up Shit Creek after Millay. The dead cat is her mentor, the late Sir Nicholas Ridley. This is an echo of her arrival in Downing Street, and there was a speech bubble originally on the cartoon, and it said, "In the words of St. Francis of Assisi, quack quack, moo moo, cock-a-doodle-doo." And in this 1990, they were 20 points behind in the polls. It was a disastrous showing all round. They were still, banging on. They were in charge. They were going forward, the strength to succeed. But actually, members of her Tory party, what they wanted was for a tree to fall on her or for sudden death to occur. So this is called the golden scenario. And, as luck would have it, within actually a couple of weeks of that, on the issue of Europe, nothing to do with the poll tax. The poll tax was killing them. But it was the issue of Europe that always drives the Tory party mad, and in this instance drove Geoffrey Howe, her long-time sidekick, her former Chancellor, her former Foreign Secretary. At this time he had been leader of the House, but he resigned in disgust with the way she'd been treating him about Europe. She'd become very anti-Europe, and he was much more nuanced about it, but he resented the way she treated him. But his withering resignation speech, by tradition in Parliament of the UK, a resignation speech by a minister cannot be interrupted by anybody, and he just let rip, and she just had to sit there and take it. And that enabled Heseltine, a long-time foe, to leap in. It wasn't me who depicted him as Tarzan, he's just because he had long blonde hair and he used to wear leopard skin trousers. But anyway, he leapt in and challenged her for the leadership. And within a couple of days, she was gone. I mean, it became obvious to her that she couldn't sustain support within the members of the party, within the members of the parliamentary party anyway. As you'll note, these two were the first big cartoons I ever did for the Guardian. I'd been doing the strip for years by then, but these ones appeared on the main editorial pages. And that's an early appearance of John Major as a crocodile weeping. "We must pause to consider her achievements," said Michael Heseltine after she'd resigned. Terribly ironic politics. And so she was gone. And there's proof of the mad eye. She had this staring left eye and hooded right eye, and that was what I based my caricature of her on. And I only saw photographic proof the day of her political demise. And this is the day of her actual demise. And she's off down to hell. She's asking, "Why is this pit still open?" As David Cameron, George Osborne, and Ed Miliband weep. And the Daily Mail plucked it up that day and plastered it all over one of their pages, and they said, "Crawling out of the woodwork, the old lefties spewing bile." And there I am at the top of the list. And it was the proudest day of my life to be denounced in the Daily. And they had to pay for it too, the bastards, because they didn't ask permission. She was followed, of course, by John Major, a totally different prospect. You had the supposed mad conviction politician, followed by a kind of uber nerd. You can see this wonderfully framed photo. There's John Major. There's the lampshade. I think the lampshade is coming off better in terms of charisma. These are sketches I made of him at Thatcher's last conference as leader. And he gave a very plausible speech about his humble origins and why he was a Tory and why he'd run away from the circus to become a bank clerk and all the rest of it. And he came across very well. He was very good. He was all things to all people. What I was fascinated by was his upper lip, so doing these sketches live, as it were. And he's got a kind of ingrowing moustache. I can only describe it as that. And so I was asked, a couple of weeks later, he actually became leader. He actually won the leadership contest against all expectations. Heseltine was nowhere. He won. And so I was asked to do a special about it. So I did this 2-page special based on a Superman myth called Son of Kong, with the demise of Queen Kong, who's destroying civilization as she goes. And out of a phone box comes an obscure bank clerk from Kent saying, "I want you to all look at the figures." Who is that man with his underpants outside his trousers? Because, of course, Superman wears all-over blue body stocking with a sleek red briefs over the top. And, of course, John Major, by extension, super useless man wears a grey suit with a pair of Airtex Marks and Sparks Y-fronts over the top. It's pure logic, that's all it is. But it stuck, and it worked, and I just flogged it, and flogged it, flogged it, and flogged it. This is when he unexpectedly won an election in '92. You know, we were all expecting Labour might have a chance, and he won. He got a huge vote. I mean, he reduced majority, but he got a big popular vote. It's a cartoon born of despair, based on an old Russian engraving of, or an illustration, if you like, a sort of wedding cake. We rule you, we fool you. I've added a few verses. We thicken you, we sicken you, we tax you, we sax you, we're outrageous, but you vote for us. But the Major victory didn't last long, because there was a terrible financial crisis, and the pound dropped out of the ERM, the European exchange rate mechanism of the European currency union, and the pound plummeted, and here the Tories lost all their economic credibility, and so it was like a 5-year slow death from then on. The only things that stood out in terms of his legacy were the Cone hotline and generalised sleaze. And in the end, just let the pants do the talking. So there. Until it finally gave out, beginning of '97, he finally announced the last possible chance he had to call an election. So, Unterhosen Dämmerung, which means twilight of the underpants. And he was gone, and this weird character took over. Now, this is a sketch of Tony Blair I did. I was having trouble drawing Blair. He's got various features like big ears and big teeth, but it wasn't until I did this sketch. This is the very sketch I have in my sketchbook, done from life. Actually, it wasn't done from life, it was done off the TV, but it was at a party conference. He was being interviewed by somebody, and I noticed a flicker, and I sort of noted it down in my little book. And the flicker is a sort of angry left eye, and a twinkly right eye, and I thought, oh, where have I seen that before? And of course, it came to me the very same day. Yes, it's her. He lives on. So this is him delivering his speech that day at his first conference as leader in Blackpool, and becoming her. And she was actually quite fulsome in her praise of him. She said, and this was a terrible insult to Major, if you think about it, because he was Prime Minister, she said about Blair, "My legacy is safe in his hands," which was a real one in the eye for poor old Major. And then the election of '97 was pretty well a shoo-in, but he did, I can't believe he's not Tory. Poor old John was clearly on his way out, and I was drawing, the first colour ones in the paper, these were, that I had ever done. And then the pants, finally and at last, were gone. And the preachy one became in charge. You can't say a great deal about it. Well, there's too many things to say about Blair, but the great thing from a caricature point of view is that you can apply that kind of, what's the word, the sort of equation of the eyeballs, and you add it to a sort of pointy head and big ears, and you can turn him into anything you like, the back end of a jet, or a pylon, or Bambi, because he was called Bambi early on, because of his extreme youth. The evil Bambi he is. And then the likes of Bush come along, and some are quick. Thatcher took years to get. Blair took, well, certainly months and months. But somebody like Bush came along, I didn't quite know how to do it, this is early on. But he was awarded the election. As you remember, Florida was very indecisive. There was a long delay between the election and the actual announcement of the result. But what happened was the Supreme Court awarded Florida to the Republicans, and that was it. The Republicans won. And so I had to draw Bush as president. And so I thought, in the footsteps of Ronald Reagan, who was in a film called Bedtime for Bonzo with a chimp, so I made Bush the chimp. It's blindingly, simple, obvious. Don't know why, but as soon as I started drawing as a chimp, he worked. It worked. There's something about him. You put a ray gun in each paw, and suddenly, chimpish. He has very low-slung ears. That's another weird thing about him. But you look at the way he moves, he's got a kind of chimpy way of, like that. Bigs himself up. Stumble bum, and then he arrives in Europe. And then, of course, within a few months of that, the 9/11 happened, so which is just one of those things happens well, you have to deal with it. What do you do? It's a horrible event happening before your eyes, so this is what I did. I know lots of other cartoonists did exactly the same idea. You end up with a kind of illustration of something horrible. But I wasn't going to start treating Bush as a statesman, nor Tony Blair, because Blair rushed to be with him, to support him at Camp David, and the two of them were strutting around in bomber jackets, which I thought was interesting body language. And everybody was taught there's a fashion for kind of Churchillian understatement all of a sudden. We shall not flag nor fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight somebody or other on the beaches, in the fields, and on the hills of somewhere or other. We shall never surrender, and so on and so on. And so it goes on, which leads on to these idiot series of wars we've had. Afghanistan, which is still going on to this day, which this is a particularly egregious piece of nastiness in Mazar-e-Sharif. Bush got bored with that and moved on to Iraq, which was a sort of inevitable thing. Well, it's not inevitable, but it happened. And you're watching this thing take place before your eyes. How the hell can we try and stop it? There were massive demonstrations across the board. Why won't they see things our way, George? My fellow Americans, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, shock, and awe. Now that's such a horrible euphemism, isn't it? Such a vile piece of advertising, a piece of promotional language for a essentially disgusting act of blowing people up from a great distance and great height. The humanitarian thrust continues, danger unimpersonal civilians. And a kind of welling sense of disgust and despair, and you end up doing a cartoon like that. It's not a particularly good cartoon. There will be a role for the NUN, it's an odd role. There's shit everywhere, and there's Saddam, there's a rat on the right, there's Blair as a dog. But I sent it in, and as you know, I work for The Guardian. The Guardian, by and large, very good. They let me get away with all sorts of stuff. But this was one instance, this is one turd too far, and Georgina Henry, who was the then editor, she was then deputy editor, sadly she's dead now, but she was deputy editor who was acting as editor that day because the editor was away, and she rang up and said, Steve, because I always file as late as possible, that's a great clue, don't give them time to worry about it. It was a great thing. But she said, look, there's just too much shit in this drawing. So it's left me in a bit of a quandary. So how the hell? Well, it's a shit house. But anyway, we talked it through and talked around about it, and it came to a very sensible Guardian compromise, and I took out 3 chapters. And that was all right. But as I said, I often badmouth the Guardian. I've worked for them for years, so I'm entitled to it. But they've been very, 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 very. I very rarely get edited. It's usually taste and decency issues that happen, or surplus of shit, or something like that. Once or twice at the very beginning, there was a political change in wording, which I objected to and secured an agreement they wouldn't do it again. But generally, they're great. They're fine. They just let me get on with it. And but as a comic artist, you're trying to deal with something which is essentially not comic. So it puts you in a kind of quandary, in aesthetic terms at least, or artistic terms. How do you deal with somebody who is a joke figure when things that are not funny at all are happening? So this is a kind of disjunction between what's going on in Baghdad, horrible, hideous car bombings, and you've got the election campaign of 2004 taking place, which he actually won. And so this is a kind of, I quite like this one because it's a kind of sinister, it's a comic, a sort of hideous comic. It's not funny, remotely funny. And Bush created democracy. And the other thing is about our squeamishness about the imagery of war, because we are very squeamish. We don't look at it anymore. We don't get stuff coming at us day in, day out, as we did during the days of Vietnam. Nowadays, it's all edited out. It's all considered too impolite. but it is there, it's all available, it's all out there. It's on the wires. I can get access to them myself through the picture wire. But these are a couple of images. Time magazine shows the victory over Saddam, to publish one, a similar one to what they published in World War II. As they published Hitler, a grey figure, a grey head, with a red slash through it. So they thought they'd do the same with Saddam, which seemed like a jolly good idea. But I just tried to point out some of the things they were missing, like these images of children, dead bodies on trolleys in what passes for hospitals in a wrecked Iraq. And it makes me think, I suppose, about having to deal with awful things. And this is a particular instance. I mean, Iraq's bad enough, but this was a terrible event in Dunblane in 1996 when this madman came into an infant school and massacred a number of children and teacher. So I didn't have to, because I'm a political cartoonist, so it doesn't really fall into my remit, but this sort of event you just couldn't ignore. You couldn't, it was just so horrendous, so horrible. I couldn't have just copped out and done it about Tory leadership or something like that. So I was trying to work out how to do it. And in the UK, I've got 4 kids, they're all grown up now, mercifully. They all went through infant school, and every year at infant school, you get these little pictures of the class, and there they all are, sitting on benches, the rows of the kids. And so I sort of pondered it, and then I thought, oh God, yeah. So I didn't actually, it would have been horrible to rip the actual picture. I had loads of these pictures that were dreadful, but also by redrawing it, if you like. Right, if I'd used a photograph, it wouldn't have worked either. It would have been horrible, but because it's a drawing, it distances it. And that's one of the advantages of drawing. That's what gives you a certain edge, if you like, over photography or over montage or whatever. It uses all the tools of montage and photography and everything, but it floats on the top as well, and you can actually make quite effective comics. That was how do you deal with these things? This is one post-Iraq. This is one of those issues that is sort of so current, visit asylum, about our foul British press and their obsession with asylum seekers and immigrants and their hatred of immigrants, the rising tide of refugees, the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Express. They've all been vomiting on about this for years. They're all vomiting on about hatred of Europe. They've been hating Europe for so long, it's finally stuck. And now we're finally lumbered with this lunatic Brexit. But this was during the days post the first flush of success in Iraq, if you like, where the whole infrastructure's been blown to hell. There's sewage in the streets, it's a mess. It's taken from an image of actually a screen grab, if you like, from a news broadcast. But it's, it's sort of nasty. And then these contrasts we live with. This is Bosnia back in '92. How do you try and, on the one hand it's funny, on the other hand it's hell, and there's triumph of death. Royal's famous picture in the background. And this, again, the same issue. This is about the demise of Yugoslavia. Why don't they do something? Well, that's what politicians are supposed to do something. But I think we're sometimes too cruel to politicians, because this is politicians, this is Liberal Democrats in the UK. And they have a conference every year, and I love going to it because there's something cute about Liberal Democrats. And this is at the time of 9/11. They had this conference. The world's falling apart. As you can see, Liberal Focus is their paper. World ends tomorrow. Lib Dems poised to take Norwich. Yay! But this is Charles Kennedy, the late Charles Kennedy, sadly, who was their leader. This is a typical group of Lib Dems. I'm quite fond of the Lib Dems. They have a sort of collective soapy look about them. And this is Charlie with his eyes like piss holes in the snow. So Charlie was a great drinker, and that's sadly what did for him. Go back to your constituencies and prepare for bed. And then this is, he got taken, he lost the job because of drink, and then Ming Campbell took over. Go home to your constituencies and prepare for death. it's interesting. You notice sketches covered. There's usually sketches done at conferences. And I love doing it. I take my book and I take my pen. And one time, Bill Clinton came to the Labour conference. There he is, humble Bill. He sort of mumbles and sort of speaks like that, and people lean forward to hear what he's saying. And he's got the whole bloody hall in the palm of his hand. It is quite impressive when you see somebody with that control over a crowd like that. And he said, Clinton, W, Arkansas Constituency Labour Party. And they loved it. Crowd went mad. There he is. But I was trying to get the caricature, and it's the nose, stupid. And here he is, breathing sweet nothings into Tony Blair's ear. This is in 2002. This is more recent. This is going back up to date. This is last election, 2015. That's Nick Clegg. These are all done on the campaign trail. You've got Nicola Sturgeon, Dave himself again. There's always something to be learnt from drawing. I don't know why. It's hard work doing it. You have to force yourself to do it. So, but once you've done it, it's worth doing. The process is actually very. You see things you wouldn't otherwise get. That's said Miliband. That's Nellie Bennett, who was the Green leader, and that's the terrible Nigel Farage and Leanne Wood, who's the Welsh nationalist. There he is. He's got weird toad-like eyes. And this is the sort of story of the election where the head of Miliband is handed to David Cameron, aka Salome, on a plate by Nicola Sturgeon. Sunshine won the day. God, it's just another despair. And then the Labour Party, of course, takes the opportunity to go in a different direction, which is towards Jeremy Corbyn. So Tony Blair steps in and offers some advice, which of course has the directly opposite effect to that which he wants, because he's not deeply popular within the Labour Party. But the Labour Party was a hell of a mess. These are all the putative candidates, but they were just wiped out by Corbyn, who won 60% of the vote. And then he has just faced a hail of crap ever since. I mean, it put me in an awkward position. Here he is being lambasted for not singing the national anthem. Show the Queen your tonsils, traitor! But I'm now faced, people often ask me, what would you do with a government who you agree with? It's not a government, it's a party. I suppose I generally agree with most of what Jeremy says. He's not the most brilliant speaker on earth, but I tend to sympathise with what he says. I tend to agree with what he says. I don't think he's as inept as he's painted, but his ideas are totally rendered illegitimate. They are not permissible at all. And the problem is, one whole swathe of the Labour Party, which includes a large chunk of the MPs, actually hate him. They loathe him. They despise him. They hate him far worse than they hate the Tories. But I'm with him on Trident, for instance. But I've tried drawing him as Obi-Wan Kenobi. He has a sort of resemblance to him. Sort of worked for a while, but I don't know. Well, the one who did work was George Osborne as Darth Vader. George Osborne, who's our late Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's not late, he's dead, he's still alive, he's still making money. He's just not in politics anymore. But he's got these evil eyes and he's got a bum nose, so it's his idea. Is this your allotment, mate? Corbyn is well known for having an allotment in North London where he lives a frugal life. Well, it's mine to work on as I please, but the land itself belongs to the larger community. So it's a communist plot then. Anyway, the Chinese came for a state visit to launch a nuclear power station in Somerset, which they're going to build, or the French are going to run, and the whole thing's a total disaster, and it's going to cost an arm and a leg, and it's a white elephant on skis, or roller skates, if you like. And then the Chinese left, and left with the clothing. Our long-term economic plan is clearly working, George, and I sent this to the paper, and I knew I wasn't going to get away with it. I knew that it would be published. Well, I didn't know it would be published, but that's how it was published. You can't show the Queen's bum. No, it's not possible. Oh, well, you can try. 200 years we haven't advanced at all. Sorry, oops, I bounced. But Dave was in a position trying to sell this referendum in Europe, or going around to sell his position, which was to go around Europe pretending he was renegotiating the terms, and all the European leaders were saying, "You what? What are you here for? Do you want a sandwich?" And effectively, Dave was naked. That's why I'm drawing him naked. The emperor had no clothes at all. He had no policy clothes. He was in a dire position. And then Boris Johnson turned on him. And even Theresa May, who was supposed to be a Remainer, she was Home Secretary for many years, and she called for Britain to secede from the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a nonsense, because if you do that, you're out of the EU. You can't be in the EU if you secede from that. But she's actually proposed it, so it shows where she's coming from. I mean, she pretended to be a Remainer, she wasn't really. And this is a quote Dave actually said. He said, "Do I believe that at the end of this we can all come together and accept the result? Absolutely I do." Sadly, it didn't quite work. But the whole Brexit thing was about immigration, which is about race, essentially. It's a kind of about coded grumbling on race. And they've all been going about the fair dinkum Australian-style point system. Well, fair dinkum, my arse. Anyway, and then this bugger, Farage, came up with this disgusting poster which said breaking point in the original. It was a poster of people fleeing, basically, the war in Syria and the various other wars, and coming into Europe, and there was this scene of a queue of people coming around, of mainly dusky origin, breaking point. It was a horrible moment in the referendum, just immediately prior to the referendum, and it coincided with a Labour MP getting murdered by a mad racist, a woman called Jo Cox. That was a terrible moment. And then the day of the election, I've applied the old Zek cartoon myself, and I didn't know what the result was going to be. I was hoping it was going to be to stay in, but the price of European holidays has increased, official, which is true with a vengeance, because, of course, as soon as the result was known, the pound went down like it just plummeted. And Cameron was finished. He couldn't stay. He was gone. And Boris was the clear front runner. There was another bloke called Michael Gove, who'd been a supporter of Boris's, and of course there was Theresa. But then Michael Gove turned on Boris. There was a historic moment and just completely shafted him. The Tory party were in complete disarray. The issue that screwed them for so many years, they were complete daggers drawn with each other. So what does the Labour Party choose to do at this moment? It chooses to turn on its own leader, to form a circular firing squad and kill itself. It beggars belief. I mean, the strategic nous of these people is, well, beyond anything I can imagine. And Boris was gone, and then Theresa turned out to be the only candidate left. They didn't actually have an election. She was just left standing. There she is, and there's Dave, who was expected to stay until the autumn, was catapulted out. But Theresa's an interesting character, because she came to prominence firstly in 2002 when Labour were riding high, when Tony Blair was in charge, and the Tories were suffering under Ian Duncan Smith, this weird character in the middle. But she was saying, the Tory party's got to change, we've got to update ourselves. We've been known as the nasty party, so I sort of, I paraphrased her thing. But that's the young Theresa in 2002. It's a sketch at the same time. She has a wonderful caricaturable face. She's all the things you need. She also has a strange dress sense. Her hair changes, it's quite helmet-like sometimes not. But she has this strange, you look at her necklines, often she wears this thing which looks like her head's poking out of a cannon. This one was where it had been ripped like that. And here she is again. And clothes, she loves clothes, but they don't hang on her well. She's quite awkward, she's quite sort of gawky. And if you don't believe me, look at the photograph. But there she is, securing the zombie holocaust. But The one thing you did know about Theresa was she hates Boris. And we know that because when she was Home Secretary, Boris, who was then Mayor of London, went to Germany and bought a couple of second-hand water cannon to, I suppose, to squirt rioting paupers on the streets. And Theresa, as Home Secretary, refused to grant him a license. So Boris was left with a pair of useless water cannons. So that's what that cartoon's about. But then the odd thing was, Theresa turned him into her Foreign Secretary, someone who'd sort of been openly abusive, and actually still is openly abusive. He openly makes fun of Boris, even though he's one of her most senior ministers now. But here he is, commanding the world. And here's the lady and her three jokers. That's the three Brexiteers, Pignos, Porkos, and Psychos. Liam Fox, Boris, and David Davis. And the dead horse of Torydom. And here they are, Dogs Brexit. All well. And that's what I've revolved to. There's a lot of cliff top action now because everything's about to project us off a cliff. This cliff we're poised to leap off. We don't know where we're going. There she goes. And there's poor old Corbyn is obliged to follow suit because nobody wants to gainsay the result of the referendum, which wasn't that conclusive, but there you go. And then we've got this bugger who suddenly arrives on the scene. It's just beggars belief. I tried doing it in various ways. There's something weird about his hair, as anybody can see, so I started thinking about, they said I had a dead cat on my head. And it's not a dead cat, it's a penis, and American people love my penis. I wear my penis with pride. Go penis, go penis! Just too goddamn big for my pants, which is why I wear it on my head. Oh, you! Go penis, go penis. Well, I submitted this strip to The Guardian, and they said, no, look, too much, it's too penisy. So, so I made some subtle changes. So, manhood, go manhood, go manhood. And I took out some of the overtly penisy notes anyway. But it was... sort of, I throw up ideas and you think, can I go with that one? And it doesn't quite somehow do it. And then the election campaign, he's now the candidate, he's now running. It's a strange thing what's going on, these strange recordings of what he did. But he takes this weird medication for his hair, apparently, called Propecia, which is actually based on a treatment for prostate cancer, but if you take smaller doses, it's actually quite good at making your hair regrow. But this stuff is quite dangerous and actually has a side effect of totally destroying your libido. So you look at his great strutting macho man, but actually there's nothing there. It's all imaginary. So here he is. So perhaps the pussy grabbing thing was a story he just ran up the flagpole. That's just bizarre. This is a wishful thinking. Sometimes you're subject to wishful thinking in cartoons. I thought that Hillary was in with a chance, God help me. He came up with that expression, nasty woman, nasty woman. And you just can't believe the man just says stuff like that and gets away with it. And then the day of the election, I couldn't believe he was going to win. I just could not believe he was going to. So I did this one. And it's based, of course, on there's a wonderful image from a film by D.W. Griffith called Birth of a Nation. Now, D.W. Griffith was very pro-Ku Klux Klan, and so there's a lot of Klan imagery in it. And this is the heroic Klansman, which is one of the main images in the poster of the film. So he's saying, private citizenship, here I come. He's got his hair ablaze above him. But one of the editors, actually very wisely as it turned out, said, look, Steve, he might actually win. I said, no, it's not possible. He might, he could win. I said, what do you know? He said, we don't know anything, but he could win. So anyway, he prevailed, and I eventually changed the wording to screw that. And so it's become slightly more ambiguous. And I'm glad he did, because you should never second guess elections. It's a rule of, it should be a rule of political cartooning, but you can't. You don't know how people are going to vote. And then this is the day of waking up to that result and thinking, oh, Christ. Oh, God, what can you do? It's just, what can you say about it? I mean, so I just came up with that. It's not the first person I've drawn as a head with a toilet. I've done it many times in the past. And I just, it was just a rejection, but the interesting detail is the gold toilet lid, because that's sort of, anyway. So I sort of I did it, and I thought, oh God, I was just pissed off all round. But it does sort of work, and it does sort of run, and it works in a comic way. And this is, of course, is based on one of the best-known low cartoons of the last century, a fabulous cartoon called Rendezvous, which is, of course, Hitler and Stalin meeting over the body of Poland at the time of the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. And Hitler is saying, the scum of the earth, I believe, and Stalin is saying, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. And it's one of those, like plum pudding in danger, it just says it all. I remember I first saw this cartoon in a history book when I was a kid, and it just leaps out at you, and you think, my God. Yeah. And that's the man born in Dunedin, that's Sir David Lowe. Still the greatest yet, I think. This is the Trump family. There's the little rat inside the shithouse, which is Steve Bannon. This is Person of the Year. This is him actually being inaugurated. Did you see the pictures of his wife? That was the weirdest thing. I mean, her face, she was like a corpse. And when the cameras, when he smiled at her, she went, and then he turned away. It was odd. And that, of course, that old chestnut. But he actually did get an invitation for a state visit. And I just wonder what's going to happen in that state coach. You can't conceive of it. It's awful. But the state of the Tory front bench now is one in which Enoch Powell would be happy. It's such a disaster. It's so awful, the late Enoch Powell. And then Theresa awards him this state visit, and the Speaker, very properly and good for him, the Speaker, John Bercow, says, no, you're not coming to speak to both houses of Parliament, you don't deserve it, which is a wonderful insult, and I'm sure was taken as such, much to Theresa May's disgruntlement. And here he was at the National Prayer Breakfast in the words of Jesus Christ, get out of my country. And what else can you say about Trump? This is probably the last one I did of Trump, which is actually as a mug design of the golden toilet. I've changed from a pluribus unum, meaning out of the many one, to a Trumpibus magnum cacat, which means from Trump, big shit. But I checked that on Google Translate, so I'm sure it's all fine. Anyway, thanks for listening. That's